thing is, what bears on this, and I think Uma touched on it at least tangentially. We talked about the social and material qualities, is the political situation. It's because there are such constraints as in India on what you can say without getting into trouble. When you start to think outside the box about Rama or Sita or something, there's this very powerful pushback. And that has been a change over time, especially with the change in the political situation in India. So when I first started working in India, my colleagues and everybody around was just fascinated that an American would speak Sanskrit or understand Sanskrit or read Sanskrit. They were so delighted by it in a sense. And they would say, and I don't know whether this is a compliment or an insult, because they would say, you must have been an Indian in your previous birth, which is a nice thing to say. But then the question is, why am I not an Indian anymore in this birth? What have I done wrong to degenerate into this lecherhood? Anyway, that's another story. But these days, things you write, people start attacking you. And I've been trolled and attacked and threatened, and that kind of thing puts a chill on scholarship on all sides. And that's a real issue that people have to contend with. Now, how dare you study Sanskrit? You can't possibly understand it because you don't have the adhikara to understand Sanskrit, So this is this kind of narrowing from that side that say Indian studies can only be studied by a certain narrow set of people that they deem appropriate. So that's another rather disturbing factor about the field that needs to be kept in mind.
I think the World Sanskrit Conference is great testimony that isn't really the whole of the field today. And this kind of, the role that politics is playing, and a very strange form of politics, which you really see in social media. So I think a lot of the kind of trolling you're talking about is happening. To be fair, it's not happening only in India. You have a lot of it in, across the world, and especially in the US too. And it's coming through media like Twitter and so on. And I can understand exactly what you're talking about, that one is afraid of saying something that is politically incorrect. But I also believe that has kind of been around. That's the kind of risk that academics have faced for a long time, and especially people working with contested fields like history and like something like Sanskrit literature. Which brings me to my question, that what, according to your experience, so this is a methodological, a philosophical question, if you like. What, according to your experience, is the relationship between literature and history? How do we read literature for history? As briefly, of course, as you will allow. Bob, you want to go first?
Take that, Umar.
Okay, I'll pick it up from the point of view of having taught in an undergraduate college for many, many years, where the two most lively departments were actually the literature department and the history department. Now, what was really interesting, I think, is the crossover that's begun to happen. The history department is perhaps more structured, doing a lot of its teaching using frameworks, chronology, time, and stuff like that. But the literature department has become quite radical in terms of the text that they're including. So one of the good things that happened when they threw out the sort of high canon from the literature course is that they began to introduce other literatures into the course, translations, and including texts from early times. And one of the interesting things that they did was to include Greek texts, and now there were Sanskrit texts. So there was they had a portion of the Mahabharata, the Sabha Parvan, was actually put into the course. So I think that one of the interesting things is that, and I have never been able to look at the text simply from the point of view of the text and context kind of thing. I do also find myself reading into the text. That is, what is the text actually saying? And what's the internal dynamic in the text? So I think that literary readings, literature has inspired, and the crossover in the humanities has inspired very fertile ways in which we can engage with texts. And I'm not sure whether I'm doing I'm not doing a literary reading, but I'm definitely doing a reading of the text. And that is very literature inspired. The questions around chronology and history and composition and all of that, that never goes away. But it's also this other thing, what is the text saying within itself, in terms. So I think I'm using literary techniques when I'm looking at texts. So it seems to me that this has been one of the good things that has happened. I don't see this as, this is a fantastic resource to my mind, because it actually enables you to look at the richness of the text itself in complex ways, instead of us just treating it as sort of, this is what is being said in this canto, in this place, and whatever it is.
So those are very good points. I mean, one of the issues that one faces is there's this tradition that of sort of sanatanahood, that things remain unchanging over vast periods of time, millennial periods of time, which is certainly not the case. And so this course that we taught at JNU was called specifically Epics in History and Epics as History. And what happens to these texts over time? How are they read in different eras? They're not always read the same way, because they actually, they're taken as these kind of givens, and yet each historical period, each regional group reads them quite differently, and when necessary, changes them. That is, they create a million Ramayanas, 1,000 Mahabharatas, in Tamil, Hindi, Kannada. So that's why I became particularly fascinated with the medieval commentaries on these texts. How do these people read those texts, which are as far back in time from them as they are from us, right? And yet they're trying to rationalize these texts in terms of things that they feel are fixed values. And you see a very interesting set of changes. And in fact, I have a big article coming out probably in the next issue of the Journal of American Oriental Society on how the medieval commentators tried to position themselves between Valmiki on the one hand and all the very popular devotional Ramayanas of their era, because the Ramayana of Valmiki doesn't treat the story the same way, and it focuses on the suffering of God, because in Valmiki, Rama suffers miserably, emotionally, physically. He's nearly killed many times. He weeps, he moans, he collapses, he faints. And you don't see that, say, in the Adhyatma Ramayana and texts like that, or Tulsidas and so on, moving forward. And these guys, and they're all guys, unfortunately, position themselves in that way. And you see them at points in time, some say from the 12th to the 18th century, how you understand this text. And it really is quite different. If you look at that, they're reading the same text and they understand them quite differently. So you see that this text is a text for each of those ages. And yet each age has to reread it and try to position it against what's going on outside the text, in the other versions of the text, in popular movements, in bhakti ideologies, and so on. So that's these are living documents, and yet there was always a tendency, in my training, always to sort of Vedicize everything, like it was, iti shruti, that's it. It's the text. You can't change it or talk about it or anything like that. So I think that the historians, particularly on the Indian side, have done tremendously good work in bringing these issues in the text to the forefront. And one would like to see more of it if people don't feel constrained. I think maybe the younger generation feels constrained about what they can and can't write about. It's hard to say. That's what I found working with the history students at JNU. We were trying to loosen them up a little bit, and some of them get the chance then to come outside to Europe or the US, and then they see an entirely different way of looking at the text, and that really opens them up. I have some graduate students also from Delhi and so on who come here with certain presuppositions, and we try to shatter them, because I do that with all our students. Whatever you came with, forget about it. We don't want to hear about it. So I think this is something we really want to think about, is opening these things up.
I think one of the things I like a little footnote, I want to go to the Buddha. One of the interesting things that I've discovered recently is the explosion of the Buddha legend. I mean, it's been around for a long time, but I became aware of it because I was like stuck with the early Pali canon, and I didn't actually engage with the later material, which was also in Buddhist, in hybrid Sanskrit, and then properly in Sanskrit thereafter. But one of the things that struck me is the manner in which the legend is being, the legend about the life of the Buddha itself is dramatically being transformed in, again, from international quarters. Not maybe, I'm not sure where all it's coming from, but it's exploding along a certain line. The story of the birth, the story of, and women are getting picked up very interestingly in it. So the three characters that get picked up and written about are Mahamaya, who dies, and then Prajapati Gautami, who nurtures the Buddha, and then there's Yashoda. There's always a question mark around her. And the texts, the legends are proliferating like madly. You know, I mean, they're going all over the place in terms of their what they do with the narrative, and it's extremely rich, but it's also somewhere loses the or it's so developed that the original storyline about the Buddha, which we know from the Pali canon and a little bit onwards, completely almost disappears. So there's this very rich overlay that's coming, but it's coming with a certain kind of, let's say, a certain, as I see it, a certain kind of cost, because in some strange way, I'm attached to that, to that earlier reading of the Buddha's life and whatever. So one has to actually fight your own, intuition and instinct, and keep. And I'm as a feminist, I'm completely open to all those interpretations. But it is interesting, you know. It's a very rich moment in terms of what you're doing with the text and what you're reading off the text. And
well, if I can
exciting.
Yeah, Uma, I agree. That is exciting. I think this is a good moment for me to jump in. You've presented, I think, both of you very lucidly, this idea of reading and rereading and layering and the kind of commentary and commentary on commentary. And I want to move us from history and literature into really a more historiographical mode. You've also touched on sensitivities around contemporary politics and the conduct of South Asian studies and the kind of behaviours that we're seeing on social media and cancel culture. All of this feeds into my next question, which is posed in a deliberately challenging way, which is the academic study of literature, of history and society an unsightly and problematic remnant of the colonial project? Uma.
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think that it did determine a great deal. See, we went through these the various stages, and there was a reactive moment when we may have been sort of either internalizing or chucking back, you know, in some form. And sometimes very mechanically also, you know, we're in the early nationalist period, I think the desire to actually say that, look, we have a history and it's as rich and as complex as yours, and it's as democratic as yours also, is something that played its role. So, you know, people wrote on the Ganasanghas and then argued that actually they were democratic institutions, completely democratic institutions. It was now, this is a bit of a, it's an exaggeration. Of course, these kingdoms, quote unquote, or political entities were different and distinctive, and there was participatory rule, as it were. But you know, you can't actually take an idea from somewhere and then plant it on yourself and see. It's organically different. We have our own history and our own way in which that history has unfolded. But I think that at some point we have left that behind. I don't see that actually I have needed to battle the ghosts of the colonial legacy as far as I'm concerned. There were so many other things that we had to bring in, like you bring in gender, and what difference does it make what the colonial fellow said? I wrote a long essay at one point of time on James Mill and his ilk, but that was to also take us into to the manner in which the nationalist historian wrote. You're reacting to that, but we wanted to leave that behind and go on to our understanding of the gender question. So in that sense, I'm not sure that I'm trapped by the colonialist past, or that Orientalism is having some great impact on me. I think my questions have come, and my approach to my text has come from questions that are important to us in this society. So it seems to me, I'm not convinced. Bob, what do you think?
Well, I think this is a very important question that James raises. And certainly this was part of the beginnings of Endology, right up until near the present, at least. In the sense, if you read European works on Indian literature and so on, there's this kind of almost sneering attitude because they don't conform to the European aesthetics, the way, Arnold said of, the Homer is direct, straight, sparse, clear. Vyasa is not, but Vyasa is doing something rather different, incomparably different. And we were trained originally by these European or European trained scholars really to have a certain kind of contempt for the Indian interpretations of their own texts. So when I started reading these commentators, I was actively discouraged. These guys didn't know anything. What do they have to say? You have to really read the German. And, the critiques they have the Mahabharata by Oldenburg and so on is it's a jungle, it's a mess, it grew in a horrible organic way. But they didn't understand the text in its own aesthetic and its own way. And that was something we were trying to break away from. And so one of the experiences I had was when I was in India all those years, I read those texts every day with traditionally trained pundits, and with very different attitudes. Their knowledge of the world outside those texts was rather limited, right? And we would, go back and forth over them. So the idea has been to kind of break away from that. And there's this reaction coming, as Uma mentioned, from the Indian side, that this is an abusive kind of scholarship. It's exploitive, it's Orientalist, et cetera, which it was, and often can be. So the point is, one has to really, cultures need to read together. You can't just, it's spread this reaction is now the Indian reaction is, no, it's all Orientalist. You can't read an Indian text. You're not allowed. You don't have adhikara, in the words of this Rajiv Malhotra, who's this character here. So you need to be sensitive to that. I believe no culture has the exclusive right to its own cultural production. These are all parts of the human experience. And the more you read more widely, the more humane your attitude toward the world is. And this is why we encourage our students to get out of your narrow mold, read Chinese literature, read Indian literature. There's an old world out there that you know nothing about. And in our schools, we're very deficient in teaching about non-European systems. But you have to read with, and not in a kind of unequal way, a superior way that the Western scholar is going to come in to tell you how to read your own text. This is really an intolerable kind of thing. This is why I want to read how Indian scholars, that is the commentators, and say, how did they read the text and why did they read them the way they did? So this is an important point.
Bob, I love that. So sorry, I just wanted to say you've really captured something there, I think, very elegantly. Instead of sort of bigotries and counter bigotries, simply reading together. That's a lovely and I think very powerful encapsulation. And thank you for that. And I'm going to pass to Shonalika to take the next question.
One footnote to that, if I can.
Please.
These, people, it also breaks people out of their own modes of thinking. I used to read the Ramayana and its commentaries every day with the late Srinivas Shastri in Pune. He grew up, he didn't memorize the Ramayana in effect, right? If you quoted a shloka from the Ramayana, he could continue from there, no matter where, And it became internalized, his idea of the Ramayana. But when you read it closely, and when you look at the commentaries, I would say to him, what does this mean? I don't understand this passage. And he would say, I'll just think for a second and tell you. Then he'd look at it. Then he'd talk to this other guy, Venugopalan, in Tamil, and they'd argue about it. Then he'd look at me and he'd say, Ishvaro Veda, God knows. In other words, he didn't understand it. He had memorized it, and he didn't think about it. But then he started to think about it. What does it mean? Why does he say that, Because you're trained in a certain way. But anyway, I don't want to take the time. Shonalika, yeah.
Okay, so you both have, in different ways, shown the importance and potential of studying the categories of gender, caste, and class in ancient Indic texts. And these have really dominated the agenda, as it were, of historical research, I can say, for the last couple of decades. But since we are talking of newness and we are talking of freshness now, how do you think we can move forward from here? What are the other categories in our texts that await creative exploration now that haven't been touched on yet, would you say? Either
That's
of you.
Difficult question. I don't know. Let me think.
Can I initiate some of this? Because some of my recent thoughts have been, and some of my recent work has been about actually just opening up the question of time and space itself. So different differential understandings of time in South Asian temporalities, which are often quite different from how Western or other parts of the world may have spoken of time. And it's really a kind of global hegemonic temporal regime that exists today, which has tended to marginalize South Asian responses to the question of time. And in the same way, space. How do we actually conceptualize space? How have our texts conceptualized space as different from how we may understand or delineate it in modern times? And, I'm reminded of Bob's essay, which has been a perennial favorite of mine, about Ayodhya as the city of the heart. And we talked about how the realities of fantasy, if I'm quoting you correctly, are often more powerful than the realities of history and geography. So that kind of sensitivity, I think, can help us unearth a number of more interesting things from the text. What would you say?
Yes, it's a good point, because there are these very particular notions of time that underlie a lot of the text. I mean, if in a sense, you read Mahabharata, it's Kala, which is its central theme in a way, time, and a notion of time. And people have written on it. There's a lot of writing on cyclical time. My late friend and colleague, Luis Gonzalez Reymen, who wrote, a lot about the Indian theories of time. And it's another way of putting you in a different mind space. Because, growing up, say, in the West, you're taught, you think, you absorb the idea, time is linear, right? Time is no more. That's it. Because the religious tradition of the West, the dominant ones, just teach there was a creation, and then there was time winds down to the end of days, and that's it. Whereas the Indian tradition is quite different. There is no beginning of time and there's no end of time, and that time moves through certain cycles, and that cycles have their own qualities, and that therefore texts about historical moments are time sensitive as well, because say the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, they belong to different eras of time. This is the Treta versus the Dwapara Yuga, and there are different conceptions of what the world is like in different ages of the world, and gives explicatory value to some of the features of these texts. Why are the characters in one text acting in a certain way in a given situation, whereas in the other text, so you move from, say, this kind of very deontological ethic of the Ramayana to this kind of casuistic ethic of the Mahabharata. That is, the idea is to win by any means necessary under the guidance of this devious figure of Krishna, who was also that less devious figure of Rama. So people get this understanding, and it bleeds into the notion of the vulnerabilities of the present. We're all living in this Kali age, and we understand that things are shaky and so on. So you look back to different times and so on and so forth. So there's that kind of notion. Space also, because the different traditions, if you look at the Jain, the Buddhist, and the Hindu text, nations of what the world is like, what space is like. How many worlds are there anyway? Are there 3? Are there 7? Are there infinite? Where are we situated in this continent, on that kind? There's a lot of speculation. So I think it's a good point to raise by Swarnalika, that that needs a lot more intensive unpacking, so to speak.
And also
So
plurality, right? I mean, the traditions are always plural, because you spoke about cyclical versus linear time, but then there are many traditions, including the Buddhist from India, which are talking of a nihilistic idea of time, where time ceases. And you have that also in yoga, where you can actually, leap through time. So there's actually a lot more variety than just the cyclical and the linear. Uma, you were saying.
No, I'd like to actually go back to the, you can think a little bit differently when you get to the Buddhist texts. See, even the manner in which those texts have finally been compiled and codified and passed down to us have such a rich history in terms of time and space, I mean, so, okay, there's the age of the Buddha, whatever is happening at that point of time, and the setting up of the Sangha, the rules and whatever. And then that material actually is with its commentaries and so on, is kind of